Hi, so my name is Raieste. I lead public sector in Nortal, a global digital transformation consulting research and development company.
Hi, my name is Keegan McBride. I'm a lecturer in AI, Government and Policy at the University of Oxford and a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security and Technology and National Security. Today, we're really excited to talk to you about this new report that we've put out on government resilience in the digital age. And actually, it's quite fitting that we're talking about this today here at Tallinn, which is well known as a hub for cyber resilience. We have NATO CCDCOE, we have EU LISA, there's the Tallinn Manual, which was launched after Estonia experienced one of the worst cyber attacks against the state in 2007. For this report, we wanted to tap into this excellence, but also go a little bit further than cyber resilience and cybersecurity, looking into the future about what it would mean to create states that are increasingly resilient. But first, why? Obviously, given the theme of the conference, the idea of resilience isn't really a topic that requires much justification to talk about, especially given everything going on in the world today. Everybody in this room has lived through at least one global crisis, with the COVID-19 pandemic still close at mind for many of us. For some, you might still be going through a crisis in your home countries. Many governments today are also preparing for crises that are sure to come, almost inevitable. We're living in a time of polycrisis. Conflict is up, there's war again, we just got over the pandemic, natural disasters on the rise, increasing in scale and severity and number. Historically, we know that states have always used technology to overcome these crises. But as recent experience has shown us, sometimes these plans fall a little short.
To exemplify this, nearly 30% of governments in Europe had to postpone their democratic elections during the first years of the global COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, arguably damaging the democratic process. And many countries overall, preparedness to a crisis assumes that the crisis would last for days, weeks, maybe months, but not years. But what if a crisis lasts for years, like we have seen during the past few years? The global pandemic, the recent conflicts. With that argument, we could easily argue that any long-lasting crisis can dismantle our democracies and destroy our way of living and governing ourselves, unless we find means how to make our states more resilient and perhaps even partially immune to those effects of crisis.
For many states, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted a number of weak points in their ability to function during a crisis. But let's go beyond the COVID-19 example and think about what crises mean for digital states. What if parts of the state were occupied or inaccessible? This could be due to a number of reasons, for example, disruption due to a natural disaster, an earthquake, a flood, a tsunami, but it could also be due to war or conflict, where states lose, not necessarily indefinitely, but for a period of time, control over their territory in one way or another. In these scenarios, where the government does not have complete control over its territory, how can we protect ourselves and ensure the long-term continuity of the state? This is the question that we asked ourselves when we were writing this report. So this report is the result of a cooperation between academics, industry, government officials that wanted to ask, at a time when we're living in a polycrisis, when governments are investing tremendous amounts of resources into digital technology, how could they build resilient digital states, not just 1, 2, 3 years in terms of resilience, but thinking forwards into 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years on? What would this take? As a result of this research, we've come up with 7 different policy recommendations, which we're happy to share with you today. Obviously, we can't go over the report in its entirety, but I hope you find this interesting, and we certainly did when we were working together on it.
So the first thing that we have found out is that in most countries there is a disparity between the priorities for digitalization during the times of relative stability that we've enjoyed during the past couple of decades, and for what is important for assuring the continuity of the state during times of a crisis. So digital transformation has lasted roughly for 20 or 30 years, but that was a time of relative stability and peace. And priorities were defined by relative stability. But if we're looking at what is a priority, if we're preparing for a crisis, it changes things. So what are those things that we actually need to survive? It's likely not tax records, but rather things that would provide long-term legitimacy of the state, maybe our culture, things that define who we are, also ownership, who owns what. So a paper in your pocket that you own a house actually doesn't mean much if a state registry tells otherwise, or if in reality that registry doesn't even exist anymore. So many governments still have their core legal registries still on paper or in document management systems that exist in physical locations that are bound, that are susceptible to physical damage. So COVID-19 and the recent crises that were resulting in mass displacement of people also highlighted, for example, that we require digital data mobility and different documents and credentials that are accepted internationally. Also, for example, we require to continue schooling our children when physical options are no longer available. These are the lessons that we started to understand, that the priorities are different if we're facing crisis. Also, we could argue that digital elections are perhaps the only ways how we can continue our democratic processes in times of a crisis. So overall, we have found that there is a disparity between what are the priorities during the times of a crisis and what overall is the current state of digitalization in majority of the countries. And we urge the governments to reevaluate those priorities and understand what should be the real priorities.
Of course, while ensuring that citizens have access to critical digital services like education materials is absolutely an important and essential part of guaranteeing the resilience of a state, it's also important that governments don't forget that public sector workers are citizens too. They're just as susceptible to crises as citizens are. Many governments in the resiliency plans have a sort of implicit understanding that the physical location will always be available. And what we're trying to raise awareness of is that if citizens are not able to go to the office, if the environment outside is not safe, or if, for example, the buildings don't exist anymore, there should still be some sort of inbuilt resilience here. Now, in practice, this is hard to do. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of being able to work remotely. So we would recommend governments to start looking and analyzing what are the most critical public sector jobs for ensuring the resilience of the state during a crisis. With these identified, it's important to start enabling the conditions to engage and enable a new remote-first or remote-enabled job and workforce. Beyond that, it's also important to look at the decision-making conditions and business processes to make sure that these are remote-friendly as well. If a public servant is able to access their workstation from their house, but they're still expected to come into the office to sign a piece of paper, there's probably still a little bit of work to do.
Next, avoiding single points of failure in connectivity. And that's a tough one. So this picture on my screen here probably keeps up a lot of people up at night. This is how internet works. So the submarine cables between continents. So just as Tallinn Digital Summit started, there was in the news that 2 of those cables were cut in the Nordic area. So if all of those cables are cut, then no more internet as we know it. So our digital economy, our way of life, it stops. And with the world becoming digital, the loss of connectivity during the crisis implies that effectively our citizens are cut off from the state and from the public services. So what can be done? Well, in essence, it's three things. Well, first, we need to create localized redundancy. So assuring multiple telecommunication providers are capable of providing localized redundancy. So, for example, economic incentives, tax breaks, reduction of license costs, these are the well-known policy instruments that are capable of reducing the cost of market entry and incentivizing telecommunication providers to come to the market and creating further redundancy. But there is also a need to create interoperability between different telecommunication providers. So the war in Ukraine, for example, has well highlighted globally how valuable it is to create interoperability between telecommunication providers. So if one telecommunication provider is attacked, then the other telecommunication provider is capable of sharing the load automatically with other telecommunication partners and thus creating further redundancy. So obviously this requires certain small technical preparedness, but more it requires government policies that will drive this type of policy instrument. And then coming back to the creating redundancy on a global scale. So telecommunication technologies are rapidly accelerating at this point. So high-speed satellite networks, which were not available only a few years ago, are now providing alternative means for assuring redundancy for different government authorities around the world. So adoption of alternative means of technologies in order to further the redundancy. But with everything connected, the question is how to secure all of it, especially considering that in the current security environment, there is no peace in cyberspace. And in essence, everybody requires wartime preparedness at all times. And the problem with creating cyber resilience is that there is a lot of what to secure. Most governments are full of legacy systems, and it's often very difficult to say how secure something is. For example, here is a picture of dependencies in the Estonian digital government. Looks pretty complex, but in reality, this is quite similar probably in majority of other digitalized countries. And without end-to-end strategy to cyber resilience, failing critical systems can create cascade failures. So what is the long-term solution? So there is one ingredient to this that Estonia has successfully leveraged in order to battle cyber attacks from Russia for the past decades. So there are two different strategies in the world for creating long-term cyber resilience. So try to secure what you already have and build things in a way that are already relatively secure. So we require standards and regulations that are manifesting as requirements for our digital systems. So the latter is a strategy that very few countries in the world have successfully fielded, Estonia being one of them. So establishing mandatory security standards and practical architectures that eliminate or reduce majority of the attacks, at least make the cost of attack significantly higher for the perpetrators. But still, the key problem is that digital governments are vulnerable in the physical world. So server rooms, data centers, single points of failure. So if what gets destroyed or is occupied, for example, are key registers that contain personal data or property rights, it might not only deny the citizen access to public services, but also might cause long-term legitimacy concerns for the entire state. So in local territorial content, governments are advised to create redundancy either by cloud transition or duplication of key digital public infrastructures. However, what if the crisis affects the entire country, entire territory? So the war in Ukraine started, and when Kiev was partially encircled, the Ukraine government saw effort in saving their key data and systems and moving it to countries like Estonia and Poland for safekeeping and providing safe harbor to the elements of the entire Ukrainian digital government. And later, international cloud providers also followed. So that created a situation where we could say that companies and governments operating in NATO territories are providing Ukraine government with safe harbor for the digital government. And that could also almost be considered as a new type of defensive deterrent, where like-minded governments are providing each other with safe harbor within their own territories. Key obstacle to this, obviously, is regulatory. So most governments have rules for sensitive data leaving their territories, their national borders for national security purposes. But solutions to this, like the Estonian Digital Embassy and the Ukrainian real-life need for survival, we see that these are creating motivation for the policymakers to create robust regulatory frameworks that we will all benefit from. And to do this, we also need to retain the sovereignty and not simply move the risk elsewhere, which brings us to the next topic.
We've heard a lot from different speakers throughout yesterday and also this morning on the importance of private sector industry, on public-private partnerships, and it's absolutely the case that governments are dependent on a broad, mostly international ecosystem of global actors that help to provide digital infrastructure to secure it. And as states continue to digitalize, and as they continue to adopt emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, this is not going to go away. That being said, it's absolutely essential that governments are able to enable technological innovation and find a balance between openness and risk. In practice, this probably means developing strategies to ensure graceful fallbacks. So as an example, if a government is integrating AI into its critical digital public services, how would you react if that service was no longer available? Does that mean that you should just not use AI at all? No, probably not. Does it mean that you should be able to continue to operate the service even in the event where, for example, it becomes unreliable or it goes offline for a given period of time? Probably. So it's important that governments, as they are moving forwards in developing more resilient digital states, they start to think about third-party risk management and the important balance between innovation and openness and risk.
So lastly, the constantly rising complexity is also posing new challenges to creating for the executive bodies that are responsible for managing crisis. So often the best practice in crisis management has been to push the responsibility of creating and executing crisis plans to individual organizations. So, however, with the constant rise of complexity, the interdependence in supply chains and so forth, so many organizations possibly alone cannot account anymore for cascade failures that might originate deep from the deep supply chains. So we also need vertical power structure close to the executive power of the state to be responsible for the creation and execution of end-to-end crisis management plans. And how do we know that these plans eventually, that they actually work without wanting to go through the crises ourselves? Well, we can test them So consider, for example, running a crisis resilience exercise in any type of public service administration, like the tax office or something else, but consider that we would deny access to the public administration buildings, power the buildings down, simulating a crisis scenario. What would happen? Ideally, nothing would happen. Everything would continue working because the data is not there. The data is somewhere else. The systems are somewhere else. The citizens are able to access the services online. The public sector workers can work from anywhere, also cross-border. Nothing would happen. And this is an ideal outcome, but this is well within the technical capabilities of most countries. These are the policy decisions that we need to do to make this a reality. If we do all of this, obviously the question is where this might lead to.
What we hope to draw attention to is the fact that the world is moving into a new order that will be defined by strong, resilient digital states. Getting this right is incredibly important, and if like-minded countries are able to do this and work on this together, it has the potential to usher in an era of more prosperity, economic development, innovation, security, and resilience. And with that, I would say thank you very much for coming to listen to us today, but also, this matters. This is already happening today. There are countries that are facing a threat to their physical territory. They might even disappear due to, for example, rising sea levels. So this is not just a sort of optimistic thought experiment, but it's already something that matters today. And if you're interested in the report, we have many copies in the back of the room, and we would be very happy to talk with you and answer questions. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of Tallinn Digital Summit.